Hello. Welcome to Bedtime, every day with us here at Porter Square Books. Tonight, I'm going to read for you a little bit of The Princess Bride. And I'm going to guess that probably many of you are familiar with the movie of The Princess Bride. The book is equally wonderful. It was definitely a kind of childhood classic for me. It was like the book if I had a bad dream or if I was feeling sick or something, I would read The Princess Bride. That or I would watch the Sailor Moon movie. And, they're just sort of like the feel-good, content that you want. And the cool thing about this book and the movie adaptation is that this is like one of the few cases where I don't know if the book is better than the movie. I think they're both pretty wonderful. And they're pretty similar as well, but the book has sort of an expanded view to it. Goes into detail. You get more of Inigo's backstory and Fezzik's backstory and all of that. So if you have never read the book, this here is the deluxe edition, sort of faux leather bound. Not really the one that I read as a kid, but I like it quite a bit. Mimics the one in the book where Grandpa's reading it to the kid. And so this one, the book also has the same frame story that's built in. William Goldman translated this book by Morgenstern. So that's another thing that I just sort of love, the frame within the frame. But it is something that is important to know if you want to try to read the Princess Bride book. The frame can go on a little bit. So it's right here, I believe. This much of it is introduction. So, like, a pretty substantial amount before you get to Buttercup and Wesley, which is a deterrent for some. As a kid, I didn't love the frame story part quite so much. Now I appreciate it a little bit more. So I thought I would just read to you a little bit of the very beginning of Buttercup's story. So this is sort of like when Grandpa picked up the book. So, here we go. The Princess Bride, William Goldman. The year that Buttercup was born, the most beautiful woman in the world was a French scullery maid named Annette. Annette worked in Paris for the Duke and Duchess de Guiche, and it did not escape the Duke's notice that someone extraordinary was polishing the pewter. The Duke's notice did not escape the notice of the Duchess either, who was not very beautiful and not very rich, but plenty smart. The Duchess set about studying Annette, and shortly found her adversary's tragic flaw: chocolate. Armed now, the Duchess set to work. The Palace de Guiche turned into a candy castle. Everywhere you looked, bonbons. There were piles of chocolate-covered mints in the drawing rooms, baskets of chocolate-covered nougats in the parlors. Annette never had a chance. Inside a season, she went from delicate to whopping, and the Duke never glanced in her direction without sad bewilderment clouding his eyes. Annette, it might be noted, seemed only cheerier throughout her enlargement. She eventually married the pastry chef, and they both ate a lot until old age claimed them. Things, it might be noted, did not fare so cheerily for the Duchess. The Duke, for reasons passing understanding, next became smitten with his very own mother-in-law, which caused the Duchess ulcers, only they didn't have ulcers yet. More precisely, ulcers existed, people had them, but they weren't called ulcers. The medical profession at the time called them stomach pains and felt the best cure was coffee dolloped with brandy twice a day until the pain subsided. The Duchess took her mixture faithfully, watching through the years as her husband and her mother blew kisses at each other behind her back. Not surprisingly, the Duchess's grumpiness became legendary, as Voltaire has so ably chronicled. Except this was before Voltaire. The year Buttercup turned 10, the most beautiful woman lived in Bengal, the daughter of a successful tea merchant. The girl's name was Aluthra, and her skin was of a dusky perfection unseen in India for 80 years. There have only been 11 perfect complexions in all of the world since accurate accounting began. Aluthra was 19 the year the pox plague hit Bengal. The girl survived, even if her skin did not. When Buttercup was 15, Adela Tyrrell of Sussex on the Thames was easily the most beautiful creature. Adela was 20, and so far did she outdistance the world that it seemed certain that she would be the most beautiful for many, many years. But then one day one of her suitors, she had 104 of them, exclaimed that without question Adela must be the most ideal item yet spawned. Adela, flattered, began to ponder on the truth of that statement. That night, alone in her mirror, she examined herself pore by pore. This was after mirrors. It took her until close to dawn to finish her inspection, but by that time it was clear to her that the young man had been quite correct in his assessment. She was, through no real faults of her own, perfect. As she strolled through the family rose gardens, watching the sunrise, she felt happier than she had ever been. Not only am I perfect, she said to herself, I am probably the first perfect person in the whole history of the universe. Not a part of me could stand improving. How lucky I am to be perfect and rich and sought after and sensitive and young and... Young? The mist was rising around her as Adela began to think. Well, of course I'll always be sensitive, she thought, and I'll always be rich, but I don't quite see how I'm going to manage to always be young. And when I'm not young, how am I to stay perfect? And if I'm not perfect, well, what else is there? What indeed? Adela furrowed her brow in desperate thought. It was the first time in her life her brow had ever had to furrow, and Adela gasped when she realized what she had done, horrified that she had somehow damaged it, perhaps permanently. She rushed back to her mirror and spent the morning, and although she managed to convince herself that she was still quite as perfect as ever, there was no question that she was not quite as happy as she had been. She had begun to fret. The first worry lines appeared within a fortnight. The first wrinkles within a month, and before the year was out, creases abounded. She married soon thereafter, the selfsame man who accused her of sublimity and gave him merry hell for many years. Buttercup, of course, at 15, knew none of this. And if she had, she would have found it totally unfathomable. How could someone care if she were the most beautiful woman in the world or not? What difference could it have made if you were only the third most beautiful, or the sixth? Buttercup at this time was nowhere near that high, being barely in the top 20, and that primarily on potential, certainly not on any particular care she took of herself. She hated to wash her face, she loathed the area behind her ears, she was sick of combing her hair, and did so as little as possible. What she liked to do, preferred above all else really, was to ride her horse and taunt the farm boy. Well, the horse's name was Horse. Buttercup was never long on imagination, and it came when she called it, went where she steered it, did what she told it. The farm boy did what she told him too. Actually, he was more a young man now, but he had been a farm boy when, orphaned, he had come to work for her father, and Buttercup referred to him that way still. Farm boy, fetch me this. Get me that, farm boy. Quickly, lazy thing. Trot now, or I'll tell father. As you wish. That was all he ever answered. As you wish. Fetch that, farm boy. As you wish. Dry this, farm boy. As you wish. He lived out in a hovel near the animals, and, according to Buttercup's mother, he kept it clean. He even read when he had candles. I'll leave the lad an acre in my will, Buttercup's father was fond of saying. They had acres back then. You'll spoil him, Buttercup's mother always answered. He's slaved for many years. Hard work should be rewarded. Then, rather than continue the argument, they had arguments then too, they would both turn on their daughter. You didn't bathe, her father said. I did, from Buttercup. Not with water, her father continued. You reek like a stallion. I've been riding all day, Buttercup explained. You must bathe, Buttercup, her mother joined in. The boys don't like their girls to smell of stables. "Oh, the boys!" Buttercup fairly exploded. "I do not care about the boys. Horse loves me, and that is quite sufficient, thank you." She said that speech loud, and she said it often. But like it or not, things were beginning to happen. Shortly before her 16th birthday, Buttercup realized that it had now been more than a month since any girl in the village had spoken to her. She had never much been close to girls, so the change was nothing sharp, but at least there were head nods exchanged when she rode through the village or along the cart tracks. But now, for no reason, there was nothing. A quick glance away as she approached, that was all. Buttercup cornered Cornelia one morning at the blacksmith's and asked about the silence. "I should think, after what you've done, you'd have the courtesy not to pretend to ask," came from Cordelia. "And what have I done?" "What? What?" "You've stolen them." With that, Cornelia fled, but Buttercup understood. She knew who them was. The boys. The village boys. The beef-witted, feather-brained, rattle-skulled, cod-plated, dim-domed, noodle-noggined, sap-headed, lunk-knobbed boys. How could anyone accuse her of stealing them? Why would anyone want them anyway? What good were they? All they did was pester and vex and annoy. "Can I brush your horse, Buttercup?" "Thank you, but the farm boy does that." "Can I go riding with you, Buttercup?" "Thank you, but I really do enjoy myself alone." "You think you're too good for anybody, don't you, Buttercup?" No, I don't. I just like riding by myself, that's all." But throughout her 16th year, even this kind of talk gave way to stammering and flushing, and at the very best, questions about the weather. "Do you think it's going to rain, Buttercup?" "I don't think so. The sky is blue." "Well, it might rain." "Yes, I suppose it might." "You think you're too good for anybody, don't you, Buttercup?" "No, I just don't think it's going to rain, that's all." At night, more often than not, they would congregate in the dark beyond her window and laugh about her. She ignored them. Usually the laughter would give way to insult. She paid them no mind. If they grew too damaging, the farm boy handled things, emerging silently from his hovel, thrashing a few of them, sending them flying. She never failed to thank him when he did this. "As you wish," was all he ever answered. When he was almost 17, a man in a carriage came to town and watched as she rode for provisions. He was still there on her return, peering out. She paid him no mind, and indeed, by himself, he was not important. But he marked a turning point. Other men had gone out of their way to catch sight of her. Other men had even ridden 20 miles for the privilege, as this man had. The importance here was that this was the first rich man who had bothered to do so, the first noble. And it was this man, whose name is lost to antiquity, who mentioned Buttercup to the Count. The land of Florin was set between where Sweden and Germany would eventually settle. This was before Europe. In theory, it was ruled by King Lotharen and his second wife, the Queen. But in fact, the king was barely hanging on, could rarely tell day from night, and basically spent his time in muttering. He was very old, every organ in his body had long since betrayed him, and most of his important decisions regarding Florin had a certain arbitrary quality that bothered many of the leading citizens. Prince Humperdinck actually ran things. If there had been a Europe, he would have been the most powerful man in it. Even as it was, nobody within 1,000 miles wanted to mess with him. The Count was Prince Humperdinck's only confidant. His last name was Rugen, but no one needed to use it. He was the only count in the country, the title having been bestowed by the prince as a birthday present some years before, the happening taking place, naturally, at one of the countess's parties. The countess was considerably younger than her husband. All of her clothes came from Paris. This was after Paris. And she had superb taste. This was after taste, too, but only just. And since it was such a new thing, and since the Countess was the only lady in all Florin to possess it, is there any wonder she was the leading hostess of the land? Eventually, her passion for fabric and face paint caused her to settle permanently in Paris, where she ran the only salon of international consequence. For now, she busied herself with simply sleeping on silk, eating on gold, and being the single most feared and admired woman in Florinese history. If she had figure faults, her clothes concealed them. If her face was less than divine, it was hard to tell when she got applying substances. This was before glamour, but it hadn't been for the ladies like the Countess, there would never have been a need for its invention. In sum, the Rugans were the couple of the week in Florin, and had been for many years. This is me. This is William Goldman giving an aside, which he does quite often. All abridging remarks and other comments will be in this fancy italic type, so you'll know. When I said at the start that I'd never read this book, that's true. My father read it to me, and I just quick skimmed along, crossing out whole sections when I did the abridging, leaving everything just as it was in the original Morgenstern. The first chapter is totally intact. My intrusion here is because of the way Morgenstern uses parentheses. The copy editor at Harcourt kept filling the margins of the galley proofs with questions. How can it be before Europe but after Paris? And how is it possible this happens before glamour when glamour is an ancient concept? See glamour in the Oxford English Dictionary. And eventually, I'm going crazy. What am I to make of these parentheses? When does this book take place? I don't understand anything. Help! Denise, the copy editor, has done all of my books since Boys and Girls Together, and she has never been as emotional in the margins with me before. I couldn't help her. Either Morgenstern meant them seriously, or he didn't. Or maybe he meant some of them seriously and some others he didn't, but he never said which were the seriously ones. Or maybe it was just the author's way of telling the reader stylistically that this isn't real. It never happened. That's what I think, in spite of the fact that if you read back into Florinese history, it did happen. The facts, anyways. No one can say anything about the actual motivations. All I can suggest to you is, if the parentheses bug you, don't read them. So that's where I will leave you tonight. Highly recommend The Princess Bride. Some of it is... there's some of it that could use some updating, in my opinion, just through the quick glances that I've looked at it now. But it is a fun companion to the movie, so if you've watched the movie a million times but you never read the book, highly recommend it. And I hope you all have a wonderful Sunday night. So, good night.